It's a particular pleasure to welcome this evening Shaun Walker. Shaun is a British journalist who's spent his entire career so far, that is nearly a decade and a half, reporting in Russia. And as he prepares now to leave Russia for an assignment not too far away in Eastern Europe, in Budapest, he's come out with a book, The Long Hangover, which looks at Russia's resurgence under Vladimir Putin following the shattering impact of the Soviet Union's collapse. Shaun's first trip to Russia was in 2000 when he was just 18 and when Putin had just assumed the presidency. Shaun went before entering college and spent several months teaching English at a high school in Moscow. After graduating from Oxford, where he studied Russian and Soviet history, Shaun then returned to Moscow in late 2003. He worked for an NGO for a year and then took up journalism, becoming Moscow correspondent for The Independent and then switching to The Guardian. His book mixes lots of original reporting with historical analysis of how, in crafting a new identity and sense of purpose for Russia, Putin has taken a selective approach to the past, drawing both from the Tsarist and Soviet periods, and also playing especially on Russia's deep pride in its victory over Germany during the Second World War. Putin's slogan might just as well be, "Make Russia great again." A review in Kirkus called Shaun's book, quote, "essential reading for Russian watchers." And Publishers Weekly said Shaun's, quote, "original reporting is exemplary and differentiates the book from equally well-informed but more scholarly analysis with its eye for the idiosyncratic and telling detail." So please join me in welcoming Shaun Walker.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for coming. So what I'm going to do, I'll just explain a little bit about the book, and then I'll read a little a vignette from the book. So yeah, as Brad mentioned, I've been in Russia for a long time, arriving just after Putin came into office for the first time, and now leaving, as he's about to win another 6 years in power. And the book is kind of my attempt to make sense of this 18-year period and to look at Putin's attempts to create a new sense of nation in Russia and overcome the psychological wounds of the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the same way that reading a biography of Donald Trump would only give you a sort of particular limited amount of insight into why Trump is popular, I think Putin's backgrounds and motivations personally are important, but they're only part of the story. So I've tried to tell this story through a number of portraits of very different people, from separatist commanders in the war in East Ukraine to a war veteran who fought at Stalingrad, Chechen mercenaries, gulag survivors. Vladimir Putin is a character in the book, but he's not necessarily the main character. He's just one more person who was also affected by the Soviet collapse, although, of course, his experiences at the time would go on to take on great importance for the future of Russia. And I do take as one of my starting points a newspaper column penned by Putin in late 1999, just a few days before Boris Yeltsin stepped down and made him acting president. And in this column, Putin bemoaned how weak Russia had become. He wrote that for the first time in 200 to 300 years, Russia faces the real danger that it could be relegated to the second or even the third tier of global powers. He called on Russians to unite to ensure that Russia remained what he called a first-tier nation. So, like with many post-imperial leaders, dealing with this loss of importance was almost more pressing than the loss of material wealth. Of course, he felt that social and economic indicators were also important, but there was a sense that they would come naturally if this first-tier status was reattained. So when Putin took over, he knew that he wanted to restore this first-tier status, but it wasn't clear exactly what the new Russia should look like. And so the first half of the book deals with the creation of this national idea. And for many years, it's been pretty well established that common historical triumphs or historical defeats are a good way to rally people around a national idea and to create a sense of nation. And the collapse of 1991 was certainly something that Putin could use. At times, he definitely has played to the large swathes of the Russian population who are nostalgic for the late Soviet period. But playing this card too strongly would alienate a lot of Russians, the business community and younger Russians who enjoyed the opportunities that capitalism and new money had brought them. So Putin equivocated. He famously, of course, did say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But he also said that while only a person without a heart could fail to miss the Soviet Union, only someone with no head would want to restore it. And instead of focusing on 1991 as a great betrayal, Putin instead turned to another event which had the narrative potential to unite the country and serve as a foundation stone for a new nation. And that's victory in the Second World War, or as it's still known in Russia, the Great Patriotic War. And one of my key arguments in the book is that Putin really used the war victory as a kind of national foundation myth from Russia. Pride in the defeat of Nazism transcends political allegiance, generation, or economic status, so that while there might be disagreements about the meaning of 1917 or 1991, there are very few disagreements in Russia about the meaning of 1945. Part of the reason for this, of course, is that much of the Russian war narrative really is inspiring. The Soviet Union did play a decisive role in defeating Nazism, and the Soviets' losses were incomparable with any of the other Allied nations. Almost every Russian family has a personal history relating to the war. It was also, when you look at recent Russian history, it was a victory, and a rare victory at that, a rare source of pride. Just a couple of days after his inauguration in 2000, when Putin held the first Victory Day parade of his rule and the biggest one since the Soviet collapse, he said to the veterans who were assembled on Red Square, "Through you, we got used to being a nation of winners." And as a kind of illustration of how important this idea of winning and of being winners was, I think it's quite instructive to look at the opening ceremony for the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014. So, an Olympic opening ceremony is a chance for a country to put on display everything that it's proud of about its history. And when you looked at the Sochi Olympic opening ceremony, we had this sort of beautiful evocation of Tsarist Russia with these sumptuous balls and wonderful culture. Then we had the industrialization of the Soviet 1920s and 30s. And then we didn't actually have the war on this occasion because in the Olympics you're not allowed to use military imagery. But it moved to the Yuri Gagarin's flight into space in 1961. And then that was the end. It finished there. So it was this sort of real indictment of modern Russia that there was nothing in the 53 years between 1961 and 2014 that was deemed worthy of being proud of. And when you think about it, there was the late Soviet stagnation, there was the mess in Afghanistan, there was Gorbachev's perestroika, which started off with a lot of optimism but ended with the whole country collapsing, and then there was the parceling off of the country's assets in the 1990s amid widespread poverty. So really not an enormous amount to celebrate, and I think this makes it clear why the war and that victory was such a powerful unifying force. But there was a problem too, which is that there are darker parts of the war narrative. For a start, the horrific toll that the Soviet people took made it perhaps more appropriate as a cause of somber commemoration rather than brash celebration. And aside from the general horrors of war, there were the deportations of about 2 million Soviet citizens, including the Crimean Tatars and Chechens, and also the post-war deportations of Balts and Western Ukrainians, all of which would have later significant historical consequences. More broadly, of course, there was the regime that had won the war. Putin didn't have a particular desire to lionize Stalin, but in order for the war to make sense as this big idea, Stalin had to be at the very least neutralized, because what use was a victory if it came in the service of a criminal regime? It's also, I think, quite important to note that in this slightly simplified version of the war narrative that took hold in Russia and gradually, and in the book I explain a lot more how it, in a lot more detail, how this sort of gradually took hold. But both sides of the war narrative are painted in black and white. So while the more difficult pages of the Soviet war narrative were hushed up or moved to one side, Nazism as a concept was also simplified. So Nazis doesn't mean militarism or cult of personality or the gas chambers. The cardinal sin of the Nazis was the fact they attacked the Soviet Union. And that meant that it was very easy to transpose those events onto the modern day as well. And this is a large part of what we saw happen in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea and the separatist movements in East Ukraine. The orange and black St. George's ribbon, which had become the symbol of the Soviet war victory, was almost as common a sight as the Russian flag. And the second half of the book is largely about those events of 2014, the Maidan revolution in Kiev, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in Ukraine. And this year was obviously a watershed moment in the relations between Russia and the West. It was meant to be the year when Russia would rejoin this first tier of global nations by hosting the Winter Olympics. But instead, it became the year that Russia rejoined that first tier of nations in a very different way by asserting itself in Ukraine and essentially cutting itself off from relations with the West. From then on, Putin's messaging would become much more nationalistic and ideological, and 2014 kind of became a companion date for 1945, another narrative of the Russians triumphing against a powerful enemy. So looking at all of this from the point of view of today, in many ways, Putin has succeeded in his attempts to turn Russia into a first-tier nation, as he wanted to back in 1999. We've seen the Russian intervention in Syria, which has changed the complexion of the Middle East. The whole world is fretting about Russian interference in elections. CNN recently ran a documentary about Putin that was called The Most Powerful Man in the World. And internally as well, Putin has largely succeeded in this mission to create a sense of nation, a real country, something that was absent in 2000 when it was kind of confusing what this new country that had appeared in place of the Soviet Union was meant to be. But instead of transcending the trauma of the Soviet collapse, Putin has exploited it. And this obsession with the war, this obsession of being Russia against the world, has kind of formed the upbringing of a whole new generations of Russians. And I think it will continue to endure if and when Putin finally leaves the Kremlin. So that's sort of a brief introduction to the thesis of the book. And then I'll be happy afterwards to answer any questions either about the book or about Russia more generally. I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the book. It's actually the prologue. And this is just a little vignette that took place during the war in East Ukraine in October 2014 in a place called Prose, which was a mining town, which was in the part of eastern Ukraine that at that point had been taken over by pro-Russian separatists. yeah, this is just something that sort of illustrates, I think, these themes, the title of the book, The Long Hangover, these themes of the sort of the psychological trauma that this Soviet collapse caused. There'd been an autumn chill in the air for a few days, and even inside the seized secret police headquarters, it was cold. The Romanian didn't seem to notice the temperature, apparently comfortable in his light military jacket and a single fingerless leather glove. But he clocked me shivering, and he declared it unacceptable that the town's heating system had not yet come on. He'd been to the power plant the previous day, he said, and laid down an ultimatum. They had a week to get things sorted, or he'd have the management shot for sabotage. This might have been taken for bravado, were it not for the fact that the Romanian had organized 2 public executions in the preceding weeks. Most recently, a young man in his 20s had been caught looting by some of the Romanian's men and sentenced to the ultimate punishment. He thought it was a joke until the last minute, the Romanian said, puffing his way through the latest in a steady stream of cigarettes held in his ungloved hand. The young man was executed by a bullet to the back of the head outside the shop from which he had stolen. A crowd of locals gathered to watch. Public executions seemed a little out of place in 21st century Europe, I ventured. The Romanian shrugged. Nobody blames a surgeon for the fact they removed tumors from the body with a scalpel. That's what we're doing here, with this society. Despite the name, he was very much Russian. The Romanian was his pozivnoi, a nom de guerre, chosen because one branch of his family had roots in Romania. All the fighters I met during the war in eastern Ukraine had a pozivnoi. There was the Amp, who was a former electrician, the Ramon, they were his favorite band, and the Monk, he'd never cheated on his wife. With their silly names, they often seemed like boys playing at war. But the Romanian was one of the serious ones. He radiated intensity and had a clipped military brusqueness when he spoke that bordered on disdain. Nevertheless, it was clear he enjoyed having an audience. He'd griped repeatedly when our interview was set up that he did not have time to waste chatting with journalists. But when I arrived, he proceeded to talk about his fiefdom for 3 hours with little interruption, spraying literary and biblical references, ranging from the novels of Stendhal to obscure conspiracy websites about the Bilderberg Group. Tall and lean, with closely cropped greying hair and a neat, clipped moustache, he sat at the head of a long table, drinking overbrewed tea and ashing his cigarettes into a rusting old tuna tin. The walls were bare, save for peeling light blue paint. The building had previously been the headquarters of the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Services, in the grimy mining town of Torres. Now it was a heavily fortified base controlled by the Russia-backed militias of the Donetsk People's Republic, a lawless quasi-state that had come into existence a few months previously. A retired Russian military officer, the Romanian now held the official title of the head of counterintelligence for the Ministry of State Security of the Donetsk People's Republic. In practice, this gave him license to act as a kind of vigilante ombudsman. A blonde woman with gold hoop earrings, an elaborate manicure, and a combat jacket lined with faux fur periodically entered the room to hand him sheets of paper, appeals from locals about looted property, or other grievances linked to rebel forces behaving badly. He was trying to get to the bottom of one case of a local farmer whose only cow had been pilfered by rebel soldiers. He jailed several rebels for theft. The 2 public executions for looting were justified, he said, because only the lowest form of humanity would steal the few provisions remaining in the town. In order to live by the laws of the New Testament, first we must live by the laws of the Old Testament, an eye for an eye. If the people behave like animals, we'll treat them like animals. This was the Romanian Sixth War. The first had been the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan soon after he signed up. He became an officer in the Soviet and Russian armies, and later in an Interior Ministry Special Forces unit. There was no way of verifying his claims. He never even told me his real name, but I doubted he was lying. Having been through the blood, mud, and brutality of both Chechen wars during the 1990s, he left the army. Afterwards, he tried his hand at civilian life, setting up a small construction company in Moscow. It was not a success, and he ended up working on the building sites himself to make a living. The Romanian did not like corruption. His eyes sparkled with fury whenever he brought the subject up, which was often. If he'd had his way, he'd have all the corrupt officials shot. Joseph Stalin had been right, he said. There may have been repression back then, but the country developed and progressed, and that was the main thing. Giving a bribe makes you feel like a gay, he said. It's like being raped. This repulsive man standing in front of you with a leering smile and his hand open. It's disgusting. I never gave a single bribe when I was working in construction. He continued pensively after a pause. That's probably why nothing ever worked out for me. The Romanian had come to eastern Ukraine of his own accord, he insisted. Nobody had sent him. He made regular, informal reports to old friends in the Russian security services back in Moscow, but he was spending his own small savings pot to subsist here. He'd seen footage on the news a few months previously of pro-Russian protesters burning to death in Odessa's trade union building, a horrific event in any terms, but one that Russian television had upgraded to a Nazi-inspired pogrom. He decided there was nothing for it but to travel to Donetsk himself. Just as patriotic Russians had come together to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War, he said animatedly, it was again time to join in unity against the modern-day Ukrainian fascists and their backers in Western capitals. On his lapel, he wore the orange and black St. George's ribbon, which marked the Soviet victory in the Second World War and had become the symbol of the Donetsk rebels in this new war. Although he despised the corruption of Vladimir Putin's Russia, he was pleased that over the past year, the president had done at least something, as he put it, to restore Russian prestige, annexing Crimea and providing support to the rebels. The Russian army was being revamped again. Money was being spent on defense. Maybe soon Russia would once again become a country of which he could be proud. The Romanian's trajectory over the past 2 decades was an extreme variation on a recurrent theme of post-Soviet malaise that I encountered during my years reporting from Russia and other former Soviet countries. He'd lost his way in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. Now, as he meted out summary justice on the battlefields of a messy war, he felt he was finding his bearings again. By any measure, his presence in Ukraine, commanding a ragtag bunch of armed separatists and ordering public executions, was illegal. But the Romanian didn't consider himself to be outside his homeland. His home was the Soviet Union. That was the country in which he was born, the country to which he first swore a military oath, and the country that still lived on in his heart. He admired the coal miners and steel workers of eastern Ukraine. Simple, hard-working, and morally outstanding people, he said. They made them feel like he was back in the Soviet Union. The Romanian mourned the Soviet Union's passing, but it wasn't quite right to say that he longed for its resurrection. His nostalgia was not about a devotion to Leninist principles. It was not necessarily even a striving for the same kind of lives people had led before Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and the subsequent Soviet collapse. What the Romanian really missed was something more fundamental. We need to rebuild the country, he said. The Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, it doesn't matter what you call it. I want a Russian idea for the Russian people. I don't want the Americans to teach us how to live. I want a strong country, one that you can be proud of. I want life to have some meaning again. So that's the introduction to the book, and much of the rest of it is less impressionistic, but I think the Romanian struck me as one of many characters in the book, and many middle-aged men, in fact, who were very angry, lost their way after the Soviet collapse, found it very difficult to sort of understand this new world they were living in. And, you know, he's an extreme example, but this idea that the kind of after the Soviet collapse, this whole way of life, the way that people spoke to each other, the meaning of status, of accolades, of rank, even of language, just all collapsed and left a lot of people feeling like the ground beneath their feet had fallen away. And I think that's the sort of context that that Putin's messaging, that Russia can be a great country again, is sort of operating in. So I'd be very happy to speak either about specific things on the book or generally about Russia. Thank you.
So I have a mic here, and I'll pass it to whoever has a question. Just raise your hand.
I'm not sure this should be the first question because it's, well, I'd like to understand a little better about just the people of Ukraine and how they kind of view things. And obviously there are Russian-oriented Ukrainians and there are Ukrainian-oriented Ukrainians. But I guess my question is, how separate are the two? How are they always distinct? Or are there Ukrainians who have some relation to the victory in World War II, a personal relation through their family, and have some, or maybe some appreciation for the success of the Soviet Union in its entirety. The ones that you read about and were speaking about in your vignette and so forth, obviously were the Russian-oriented ones. Certainly the Romanian, I assume, saw himself as Russian, not as Ukrainian. But in Western Ukraine, there are obviously very strong nationalistic Ukrainians but what's the middle ground there in the Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say the Romanian was actually Russian, but he'd come to Ukraine. But certainly there were a lot of Ukrainians who, especially people living in Crimea, people living in eastern Ukraine, who found this messaging very sympathetic, who'd always seen themselves sometimes as Russians or maybe just as, you know, post-Soviet citizens, and they didn't want to be drawn away from this sort of orbit of Russia. And I think, you know, this is something that I deal with a lot in the book. You know, when I'm talking about Putin needing to find a sense of nation for Russia, you know, that's also something that I think we've seen in Ukraine. So, you know, in the first 2 decades after the Soviet collapse, there are 15 new countries. And in most of those countries, there's a kind of coherent national narrative. So in the Baltic states, it's that, you know, this independence that was interrupted by the Soviet occupation has now been restored, and they're rejoining the European family. In Belarus, it's basically sort of business as usual, some kind of quasi-late Soviet system. It's as if the collapse never happened. In Central Asia, there are these new national myths based on semi-historical grounds that come up. But in Russia and Ukraine, there isn't really a coherent national narrative. In Ukraine, you have, you know, many parts of the country that have very differing views. And up until 2014, more or less, you've had a situation where the different regions of Ukraine are kind of allowed to freelance their own historical narratives. So the view of in Lviv in western Ukraine is that 1945 and the imposition of Soviet power is a tragedy, and 1991 is a celebration. The feeling in Crimea or in many parts of eastern Ukraine was that 1945 was a celebration and 1991 was a tragedy. And it's not as simple as that regional divide. Within that, you have different kinds of people with different views. And I mean, I think that a large part of that is also socioeconomic. So, what we saw in 2014 was that a lot of people who had done well, who had, felt that they'd won or had built themselves some kind of new life after the Soviet collapse, even if they were from Crimea or from eastern Ukraine, they were more likely to be on board with, they didn't buy this kind of Putin project. They were more likely to be patriotic Ukrainians, whereas people who felt that life had been very unfair to them since the Soviet collapse were much more responsive to that kind of messaging.
Thank you so much for coming. I actually have two questions. One piggybacks off this gentleman's question, which is, how is World War II seen in Ukraine, I guess across the regions? Because I think as a lot of us Western journalists in Russia discovered, it was, the nostalgia for the Soviet Union was a real thing, and a lot of things started with a kind of a seed of truth and then grew to these into these crazy propaganda monsters. So to what extent are things like, making Bandera a national hero, the banning of Russian language after 2014, or not demoting its status, to what extent were those, how were they seen, and to what extent did they contribute? And also in your talk you mentioned angry men, and there's some Russian sociologists have talked about how women kind of fared better after the Soviet collapse because they were more flexible in loss of status and losing their status. What were you able to examine that at all? Like, why were the men so angry and itching to get back into the fight? Thank you.
I think on the issue of Ukraine and the Second World War and Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist leader, it's a hugely complicated, messy topic, and it's been kind of muddied by, on the one side, kind of ludicrous Russian propaganda, on the other side, perhaps a bit of a lack of understanding in the West. And in fact, I think part of the reason that I wanted to write a book was this kind of cathartic feeling that, I'm just tired of arguing with people on all sides about this. That on the one side, I'm kind of arguing with Russians about, what's happening in Ukraine is not a fascist takeover. It's not about some kind of, Nazi-inspired ideology. On the other hand, you find yourself arguing with people in the West or people in Kiev that, there are problems with what happened on Maidan. There was an unpleasant minority. The Stepan Bandera is not really a kind of idol of any kind of progressive movement, or shouldn't be. And I think it has its roots in the same kind of post-Soviet heritage, that during the Soviet period, Bandera was not portrayed as evil because he was had views about Jews, or because the Ukrainian insurgents massacred Jews or Poles. He was perceived as evil because he was anti-Soviet. So that made it kind of, when Ukraine becomes independent, it's natural that the people you were told that were evil because they're anti-Soviet then become your heroes. So it's it's this kind of really, really complicated, messy kind of historical story, which I hope that I did a little bit to kind of put my own views forward on. In terms of the men, I think just it was, there has been a lot of writing about, that certainly in the 1990s you had a lot of situations where, men would take to drink, and it was the women and families who were doing the kind of, going off and doing shuttle trading or finding ways to make ends meet, running the family and bringing money in. It's an interesting one. Certainly, there seemed to be this particular age of people who became kind of came of age around the time when things were falling apart. So I mean, there are three commanders in the book, and all of them, I think, were between sort of 20 and 30 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and all of them spoke about it as this moment in very different ways, but as this moment where kind of things they thought were true changed, and their kind of world was just turned upside down. And obviously in their case it led to them doing all kinds of terrible things. In other people's case, maybe just led to sort of more internal personal crises. But I think it's quite a sort of powerful thing. I don't know. I think this would be more a question for sort of sociologists in terms of why it seems to affect men more than women.
How do you think the violent end of Tsarist Russia has impacted present-day national identity for Russians?
Sorry, the which Russia?
How do you think the violent end of Tsarist Russia has impacted or shaped present-day Russian national identity?
Yeah, I mean, that's, there's obviously been a lot of discussion of that last year with the centenary. And it was kind of interesting because, if you look at the official pronouncements on the meaning of 1917, Putin, for example, and other people in government are very, very careful about this because, you still have a part of the country who sees 1917 as a great tragedy, and a part of the country who sees it as, the start of this, fantastic new country. And I think, Putin's been actually quite consistent about his views, which is that upheaval, revolution is always wrong. So, whether that's in 1917 or in 1991 or in Kiev on Maidan or in Syria, overthrowing a regime is, however bad or terrible the regime is always wrong. So, this allows him to kind of square the circle of saying, we think 1917 was a tragedy, but we think the state that came about from that was, a great, powerful state. We think 1991 was a tragedy, but the new Russia is a great and powerful state. I think that it's this sort of fetishization of statehood and kind of anti upheaval, which is sort of really coloured the way that the kind of memory, the communists are allowed to still gently celebrate 1917, but it kind of hasn't been seen, hasn't been portrayed as a great event for sure.
Thank you very much. I thought it was a really great piece of writing, apart from anything else. Very, very interesting. Can I zoom out? I recognize you've been in Russia for the last 20 years or so, but maybe you've been thinking a lot about these things and can comment on it. What I'm struck by is the number of places where this kind of rewriting of the historical narrative is actually going on right now. I'm not enough a historian to know how often one can argue that this has happened in the past. But I mean, right here in the US of A, we're making America great again, right? And it seems to me that many of the components, great disappointment, in the minds of some people about what's happened, a feeling they've been betrayed by the system, a feeling the system's become very corrupt, tremendous anger about things. These are the same things. And you use the expression foundation myth, and I can see that in the two places. You said post-imperial leader to describe Putin, I think, and that's, I think, really interesting, because maybe that's exactly what we've got here, a post-imperial leader, I don't know. And two other examples just worth mentioning, I think, although they're different. I mean, what's going on in the UK right now with Brexit and so on? I mean, it's a long time since the British Empire disappeared, but I mean, arguably, that's what's going on, is that kind of the post-imperial situation is being wrestled with yet again. And people are trying to be attracted by the notion of having blue passports instead of red ones again. And even different in nature in France right now, one could argue that you have, with a different set of objectives, I think, but with the same idea of needing to re-establish the greatness of France, a new president who, in a sense, has taken France from being the basket case of Europe to being the Economist's country of the year in 5 years. So I guess my question at the end of all that would be, what are the components, do you think, that are needed in for one of these political processes to really get underway? And why has it been so extensive or successful in Russia? Does it just require a really extreme like failures for the appeal of this kind of feeling or whatever it is, the need to recreate, if you like, a glorious past? Is that what it takes, or were there components in Russia that have kind of come together in a rather unique way that actually are different from what I've been trying to describe? Sorry, that's a bit lengthy.
No, I mean, I think you're definitely right, and that there's a Russian emigre or late Russian emigre philosopher called Svetlana Boym, who has this concept of restorative nostalgia, of this kind of political idea of a kind of angry desire to recreate some kind of imaginary past. And indeed you have that with Taking Back Control in Britain. You have Make America Great Again, where it's kind of unclear, when was this previous period when America was great and when did it end. And I think maybe one of the differences in Russia is that you have these very clear hooks on which to hang these appeals on. So you don't have this sort of British situation of over a number of decades, this sort of slow decline from a major world power to a sort of middling regional power with pretensions. You have this really quite sudden situation where within a few years a country goes from one of two loads of power in the world to a sort of economic basket case which nobody takes seriously. And sort of both geopolitically and socioeconomically is sort of not really taken seriously by anyone. So I think that's probably I would guess is the main reason that makes this such a sort of successful messaging. And I mean there's certainly part of the book that it's not meant to be a polemic. It's meant to be more of kind of a diagnosis, I guess. That I'm not suggesting that. I think a lot of what Putin has done has not been for the good of Russia, but I think a lot of this desire to try and bring people together and try and infuse people with a sense of history is quite understandable just from a sort of political perspective. And he did have this pretty difficult task of this sort of wounded, messy, impoverished post-imperial nation, trying to bring that together and create a sense of country.
I was wondering if you have any opinions or observations about the Russian news network RT, specifically RT America. The reason I ask is because one of my favorite journalists, Chris Hedges, was given a show on that program, and he's very critical of American foreign policy and American corporatism. And I wanted to know what Russia's intent in that sort of programming would be, and how accurate Russian reporting on American phenomena is, how to contextualize it as an American viewer.
There is a short section in the book about RT. They were set up. The initial idea was that they were going to show the West about kind of a different side of Russia, and then it gradually transformed into something that was more about calling out problems in the West. And I think a good deal of RT's programming about America or about Britain are perfectly legitimate journalistic stories that the Guardian might run. A lot of it is not, and a lot of it is and you also have to remember that this comes from a channel that is funded by the Kremlin that doesn't do those stories about Russia. So if you're asking about whether it should be labeled a foreign agent or whether they should be banned, I think that's a bit of a dangerous line. Right up to the fact that Dmitry Kiselyov, who's a sort of a Russian television anchor, who's one of the most sort of aggressive propagandists in Russian on Russian TV, has been put on an EU sanctions list. And this allows, of course, the Russians to cry about freedom of speech and so on. Personally, I don't think Dmitry Kiselyov is a journalist, but I don't think it should be me or the the EU or the US government making those decisions about who is a journalist or who isn't. It should be, it should be something that hopefully you should be able to counter the sort of more problematic parts of the channel without kind of banning it. So yeah, I mean, I think RT is a complicated story. I think a lot of the time it's sort of like sort of fake journalism masquerading as real journalism, but I think there is also, I mean, they do plenty of stuff that's perfectly legitimate.
How do the rural population view Putin as opposed to the population of the city view his leadership and the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I mean, I think certainly when you talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, in places outside the major urban population centers, you have more people who, probably the majority of people feel that their lives are worse now than they were in, say, the late 70s. So this Soviet nostalgia is something that is a very useful device. In terms of how people view Putin, I think we see he has his approval ratings are still up in the 80s. But when you go out into these regions and you talk to people, the kind of genius of Putin really is that he's been in charge for nearly 18 years, and he's still able to portray himself as someone who's fighting the system rather than someone who is the embodiment of the system. So you go and talk to people, and they will say, life is hard, the regional bureaucrats are corrupt, like I can't get the water connected to my apartment, I can't get anything done, everything's terrible. And you say, what do you think about Putin? He's fantastic, he's doing everything he can to fight, at least he's trying to sort of make things better. So whereas, in most democracies, sort of after about a year or 2 years, or certainly by your second term, you've sort of lost that ability to portray yourself as the fighter against the system. He's kept that. So, which is why also I think that, his high approval ratings are quite fragile, because, I think there's a small group of people who are virulently anti-Putin, there's a small group of people who are incredibly pro-Putin, and then there's a large apathetic, essentially, minority who kind of don't really believe that it's possible to change anything. Of course, Putin's the best option. Of course, revolution or upheaval would be worse than what we've got. So they do support Putin. But if a sort of real, tangible alternative were to appear, it could be quite a sort of quite passive support, or quite an easily kind of crumbling support.
So I was just wondering, did you as a journalist feel any personal danger in digging for information about stories that you covered?
So, Russia is it's a difficult place to work because access is very hard. Doors are very rarely open to kind of people who are, even if someone like me who's been there for years, you count on a single hand the number of people who are kind of really close to decision making who would talk to me. In terms of actual, and then there's also, and it's got a lot worse in the last few years, this just sort of day-to-day aggression, this sense that you're kind of lying, that you're going towards a particular narrative, which gets quite tiring. But in terms of actual physical danger, I think that's something that is faced mainly by Russian journalists, and mainly by Russian regional journalists even, because, despite his reputation, I don't think Putin sort of orders people killed on a regular basis. There are some exceptions that I think probably did come from the Kremlin, but in general, the kind of thing you see with Russian journalists is it's either people who are investigating Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, or it's people investigating particular regional corruption stories, who, threatening to bring down concrete people who end up getting kind of violence against them. As a Western journalist, you're not going into that level of detail about, the deputy governor of wherever's corrupt mansion. So you have this slight extra layer of protection. So, you get hassle. They let you know that they're watching you and looking out for you, but it's not so far, at least, a kind of physical threat.
Okay, we'll make this the last one.
I would be interested in your comments on Putin's miscalculations in Ukraine, because it's commonly believed that Putin's idea was to grab at least half of the country and not just a tiny piece in the eastern part. So why the initial plan didn't work out, and what, in your opinion, the initial plan was?
So I think a lot of what happened in 2014 was like very kind of ad hoc reaction to circumstances, and there were, as is kind of often the case, I don't think Putin kind of had a grand strategy in Ukraine. I think there were different groups around the Kremlin who were pushing different agendas. So what happened in Crimea, I think, was a plan that had probably been on the shelf for some time, that was kind of taken off the shelf, but I think there are lots of other plans on. It was certainly not kind of preordained for years in advance that Russia was going to make this move on Crimea. I think it was a very specific response to sort of what happened in Kiev. I think East Ukraine was a miscalculation. I think they. There was this moment when it seemed that they might be able to create a sort of a viable kind of half of Ukraine as a statelet. That very quickly became clear that wasn't going to happen, and they'd sort of already gone too far to pull this back. Whereas obviously Crimea is a piece of land that you can seal off at a very small isthmus, and it's very easily defendable. Trying to build a sort of wall or some kind of viable border around these large regions of eastern Ukraine was kind of impossible. So, on the broad strategic level of kind of wanting a Ukraine that's never going to be part of NATO, and wanting to make sure that they still have a kind of veto over that sort of strategic decision, you could say they've succeeded, but clearly in any kind of, they've turned the vast majority of Ukraine against Russia for a generation, and it's been, and it's a sort of messy and expensive situation that they've got on their hands in East Ukraine now.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for coming.